Good evening, buonasera a tutte e a tutti. Welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò and the Department of Italian Studies at New York University. We're getting started. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the department, and I'm really delighted to be introducing tonight's event, which is one of the last events this semester. You know, the semester is going to be over in 10 days or so, so we are really at the final rush. So tonight's event is connected to the publication of a book, but it's going to be way more than just a book presentation. So Dante Politico is the title of our event tonight. Dante Politico, Now and Then. Now, Dante Politico, these two words carry a charge that has not dimmed across 7 centuries. We often think of Dante as the supreme poet of love and exile, of souls in torment and in bliss, but Dante was also a citizen, a theorist of empire, a polemicist who wrote one of the great treatises of medieval political thought, La Monarchia, and who populated his commedia with popes and emperors, saints and tyrants, positioned with surgical precision along the axis of justice and corruption. I was about to say compassion. I mean, also compassion in a way, but the right word was corruption here in my notes. To read Dante politically is to restore a dimension of his thought that was always there, urgently present, waiting to be heard. And waiting, one might argue, to be heard now, perhaps more than at any recent moment. So the volume we celebrate tonight, Perspectives on Dante Politico at the Crossroads of Arts and Sciences, edited by our colleague and friend Donatella Stocchi-Perucchio and published by the Gruyter in 2024, takes seriously the proposition that the conversation between Dante and politics is not a historical curiosity, but an ongoing provocation. The essays gathered here move across philosophy, theology, history, science, and literature, honoring the medieval conviction that knowledge does not divide itself neatly into disciplines, a conviction that the medieval university encoded in its very curriculum, the artes and the scienze, what we would today call the humanities and the sciences. And the volume's subtitle, At the Crossroads of Arts and Sciences, is at once a historical reference and a methodological wager that disciplinary integration is not merely an academic virtue, but a political one, a precondition for the kind of reflective, educated citizenship that Dante himself embodied and demanded of his readers as well as of his fellow citizens. Now, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our 4 presenters tonight. We have 4 scholars who will bring these various questions to life this evening. And what I will do, I will introduce our speakers, all of them at once, and then we will have 4 presentations followed by Q&As. So we will begin with Alison Cornish, our colleague here in the Department of Italian Studies. Alison Cornish is professor of Italian at NYU and president of the Dante Society of America. She previously taught at Yale and at the University of Michigan. She has also been a fellow of several prestigious institutions, including Villa Tatti and a Fulbright fellow. Her research centers on medieval and Renaissance Italian literature, with particular attention to the philosophical and theological dimensions of vernacular culture. Her books include Reading Dante's Stars, Vernacular Translation in Dante's Italy, Illiterate Literature, and most recently, Believing in Dante, Truth in Fiction, which won the Bridge Prize Award a couple of years ago. At Casa Italiana, she has been running a very fortunate series of events called Dante and Puntini di Sospensione, which is a lecture series aimed at bringing together scholars and thinkers from across disciplines to ask what Dante has to say to the world we actually inhabit. And of course, the short answer is he has much to tell us, right? And tonight's is also an example of this ongoing conversation with Dante. Now, then we will have Donatella Stocchi-Perucchio, who's the editor of the book presented tonight. Now, Donatella Stocchi-Perucchio holds the Arnold Lisio and Anne Morlisio Endowed Distinguished Professorship in Italian Language and Culture at the University of Rochester, and is Honorary Professor in the Humanities at the University of the Pacific in Lima, Peru. She is, of course, as I said, the editor, whose intellectual vision gave rise to the book we celebrate tonight, a volume that builds on her earlier book, Dante Politico, Ideological Reception Across Boundaries, which she co-edited with Dennis Looney, and that runs in dialogue with two monographs currently in progress. One, Reinventing the Polis, Dante for the 21st Century, and The Dante Provocation, Reawakening Our Political Nature. In this latter project, she enters into dialogue with liberation theology, decolonial thought, and Jewish diasporism, a range that gives some measure of the ambition and the urgency animating her project, and also, relevant to tonight's conversation. Then we will have another colleague of ours, Professor Maria Luisa Ardizzone, who's Professor of Italian Literature and Medieval and Contemporary Italian Studies here at NYU. Her formation across Italy and France spans medieval paleography and literature, many other things. Her research moves swiftly between the Middle Ages, medieval philosophy, politics and science, and 20th century poetry, of which she's a masterful reader and scholar. Her books include Guido Cavalcanti, The Other Middle Ages, Reading as the Angels Read, Speculation and Politics in Dante's Convivio, which received the American Association of Italian Studies Prize for the best book on the Middle Ages in 2017, and most recently, The Young Dante, Archetypes of His Early Intellectual Biography. And she has a forthcoming volume due from the Gruyter at the end of 2026, Charting Lost Medieval Paths, Studies in Inferential Philology. And finally, last but not least, we have Timothy Campbell, professor of Romance Studies at Cornell University, and the figure in tonight's conversation perhaps best positioned to ask what happens when the political thought of the Middle Ages encounters the theoretical languages of our own moment. He is very well known both as a translator and as a thinker. He has rendered into English major works by Italian philosophers such as Roberto Esposito, Paolo Virno, and Carlo Diano, making really contemporary Italian philosophy available to an Anglophone readership. His own books include The Comic Self, and he's currently completing Democratic Objects, a study of the politics of use and of the things, the objects, through which we do or do not manage to live in common, a concern, I guess, that could also be considered as Dante's own concern. So without further ado, let me call Professor Cornish to the podium, and then we will proceed with the 4 presentations again, followed by questions and answers. Thank you all for being with us.
All right, thank you, Eugenio. Thank you for introducing me, but thank you to Donatella and to Maria Luisa Ardizzone, who invited me to participate in this evening. And thank you for the book, which I read with attention, and I took my job to read the book for you and tell you what's in it. So I'm going to do that, and the phrase Dante Politico, which is the name of the conference that this book came out of, might give the impression that this is a book about Dante's politics or about his actual political action and involvement. And that is definitely present in the volume, particularly starting with the first essay by Alessandro Barbero's admirably succinct, informative intervention about Dante's political activity and party allegiance in Florence, which sort of makes it sound like jury duty, a civic obligation expected of all citizens. But for the most part, these essays deal, I think, with a double subject, which I would call the ideal and what we are used to calling the real. The conference organizer and book editor herself, here with us today, Donatella Stocchi-Perucchio, lays out the lofty goals of this group intellectual enterprise, which have to do with politics and education. Of concern to us educators might be her call to awaken a broad-based political consciousness. Donatella sets the tone for the volume by insisting that the medieval Dante, with all his attention to the other world and a solidly medieval form of Christianity, actually has a lot to say about ethics, viewed as an integral part of the human earthly and political dimension. The modern world is the material, temporal world, and its troubles are excesses of materialism, consumerism, and the unlimited accumulation of temporal goods. The project's mastermind, Donatella, brings the invective against vices, Dante's invective against these vices, into the 20th century and 21st century laments of Reaganism, Thatcherism, Voldemortism, that's my euphemism, deregulation, defunding of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the selling off of Italian artistic patrimony. She invokes prophets of our own age, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, and the Occupy Wall Street student protests. The principal evil of our modern world seems to be exactly the same as it was in Dante's, greed. Or to use a fancy Aristotelian word I found used in this book, crematistics, which is the study or art of making money and accumulating wealth for its own sake, if you didn't know. Many of the essays here emphasize how down-to-earth Dante is, and this is what makes him modern. This is the position of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, who with their grand opus Empire, from the very turn of the 21st century, invoked by several authors in the volume, propose that Dante initiates modernity by bringing everything into the plane of immanence, or what Maria Luisa Ardizzone refers to as temporality. This is because in the last book of his political treatise, De Monarchia, Dante develops the idea of beatudo huius vitae, happiness of this present life, as opposed to the other life, which to modern people seems vastly preferable, even morally preferable, to the beatitude of some other elsewhere life that is not of this world. Maria Luisa declares that Dante's Monarchia is not dreamy and idealistic, but a realistic work, at once realistic and utopian, actually, because it makes the goal of monarchy not God or even the earthly monarch, but human beings, which makes it revolutionary. Flavio Silvestrini acknowledges that the impracticability of Dante's monarchical project marks the decline of a civilization, that is, the medieval one, but its very impracticable idealism makes it representative of a specific, real context. Mirko Tavoni is very keen for us to know that the specific, real context that matters is the university town of Bologna. Stefano Selunu wants us to take seriously the political economy of the vulgar, a term deriving, of course, from the real people, the crowd, the vulgus. Diego Quaglione shows how the surreptitious interpolation of the word Deus, God, into editions of Monarchia led to much of its modern misreading. Franziska Meyer looks at how Dante's theory of language was received in China, especially in the push to replace classical Chinese with a more accessible spoken language, and as a political guide to unification and nation building in East Asia. Jorge Visa Rebagliati shows us how Dante seeps into the political art of modern Peru. But we also have some essays that describe Dante not as a realist, but as a dreamer. Claudia Di Fonso compares Dante's programmatic political dream to Cicero's Somnium Scipionis, the dream of Scipio. She cites a proposed amendment to the Italian Constitution recognizing the right to happiness, which I guess is heir to Dante. I was thinking that was 2019. It must have been a very expensive proposition, the right to happiness. Daniela Boccassini eschews the material world altogether and rejects the notion that the real applies only to what she calls the sense-based and passion-driven products of a human ingenio gone awry. She laments this desacralized world where the animated, the rational, and the divine have become severed from one another, and aspires in Dantesque fashion to return the human mind into the fold of cosmic mind. But the essay that I'm going to spend a little more time on, not a lot, but just a little, is an essay by Mariano Perez Carrasco, called Dante as Modern Utopian Thinker, and he does a kind of historiography of Dante's reception in the 19th and 20th centuries about whether Dante is modern or utopian or realist or idealist. According to Hart and Negri, Dante's Monarchy initiates modernity by discovering, allegedly for the first time, the real power of mankind when, quote, humans declared themselves masters of their own lives, producers of cities and history, and inventors of heavens, in the words of Negri and Hart. As Perez Carrasco traces it, this concept of modernity is the Enlightenment narrative of a secularized political religion, consisting of the rejection of divine and transcendent authority over worldly affairs, a process of immanentization. Dante sets the ball rolling by carving out a separate dignity, a separate authority, a separate jurisdiction for the secular political arena, in important ways equal and not subordinate to religious or ecclesiastical hierarchy and authority. A distinctive feature of this grand narrative at the core of a persistent modern mythology is the idea that what defines modernity is humanity's reappropriation of certain powers that had previously been expropriated by the medieval faith in transcendence. In the historiography traced here by Perez Carrasco, Dante is either a progressive, a prophet of the coming utopia, or regressive, attached to a discarded image of the past. In 1839, Cesare Balbo saw Dante's political treatise as purely partisan, a manifesto of the Ghibellines, an impossible dream. In 1858, the Italian patriot and author of the first history of Italian literature, Francesco de Sanctis, also used the term utopia to describe Dante's liberating and franchising vision. Vincenzo Gioberti, Catholic priest and statesman, thought modernity itself was utopic, and not in a good way. For him, the monarchia was at the outset of a modern tendency towards unreality and a regression toward paganism. As Perez Carrasco summarizes, Dante's monarchy was modern because it was pagan. Both Benedetto Croce and Antonio Gramsci saw in Dante's political ideas the perfect example of a utopia of the past. For Gramsci, it was Dante's inability to see the present that made him a utopian. Gramsci was influenced by Croce, who put everything in Dante that was useless to modernity in the category of structure, those beliefs or tenets that had been historically surpassed, such as an afterlife, while keeping in the category of poesia, the purely aesthetic. Because modern science had now taken the place of medieval theology, writes Croce, quote, our attention should dwell elsewhere. That is to say, we should read Dante just as all ingenuous readers do and are right in doing, paying little heed to the other world, very little to the moral divisions, none at all to the allegories, and greatly enjoying the poetic representations in which all the poet's multiform passion is condensed, purified, and expressed. In the modernist vision of Croce's contemporary, Giovanni Gentile, sometimes called the philosopher of fascism, while scholastic philosophy and its transcendental principle affirmed the divinity of God and the humanity of man, modern philosophy and its immanent principle affirmed the humanity of God and the divinity of man, therefore justifying a notion of the state as an absolute in itself, precisely and paradoxically because it is founded upon human authority due to its conception of man and humanity as divine and therefore absolute. For this modern thinker, Gentile, it is the intuition of the modern state that constitutes the modernity of Dante's monarchy. Perez Carrasco sums up the contrast of modern with medieval rather elegantly. He says, scholastic philosophy developed a theology of God and an anthropology of man, a politics of the state and a religion of the church, while modern philosophy created a theology of man and an anthropology of God, a religion of the state and a politics of the church. That is to say, it created a political religion. And he summarizes the continuing significance of Dante's political vision this way. I'm quoting Perez Carrasco. "We still believe in the enfranchisement of humanity from transcendental and even simply natural powers. We still believe in that earthly paradise, beatitudo huius vitae, that could allegedly be attained through the exercise of our own powers," as Dante says in the third book of the Monarchia. So, I guess the question is, are we realists or idealists? Are we modern or postmodern or pagan? Utopian dreamers or hard-boiled imminent secularists? If the epic times of modernity, as Perez Carrasco calls it, are receding, might we return to Dante's conception of two suns, two roads, two goals, two paradises, the one informing the other, for some illumination? That's what I have to say.
Then Professor Ardizzone will go first.
Just a moment. It's freezing. I am freezing. Why don't you take this conversation? I don't want you to get sick. It's freezing here. Dante Politico, Donatella Stocchi-Perucchio. The book, which features a range of prestigious, insightful contributions, finds its ideal and pragmatic center in the introductory essay by its editor, Donatella Stocchi-Perucchio. The core issues Donatella Stocchi addresses is not immediately obvious from the title. Her interest in the crossroads of arts and sciences is not merely about the relationship between literature and science, nor is it a defense of the humanities in the face of scientific development. Instead, it is a distinctly political interest, combining scholarly rigor with a passion for activism. The author reconstructs the philosophical and cultural background of Dante's political discourse, granting him also a significant role in contemporary debate. The text is structured around two temporal categories: then, the Middle Ages, and now, the present. Within the long time of the then, Stocchi introduces a pivotal text to build her argument on political Dante. Dominicus Gundisalinus, De Divisione, Philosophiae. Written around the mid-12th century, this work documents the shifts in the curricula studiorum following the introduction of the Greek-Arabic learning. Gundisalinus was a Christian philosopher and translator in Arabic Spain, who was fluent in both Latin and Arabic. While Ferdinand Vanstenberg, a very important scholar of the Middle Ages, briefly summarizes Gundisalinus' text in his La philosophie au XIIIe siècle, Stocchi-Perucchio choice to place it at the heart of a book focused on politics is particularly astute. The importance of the Divisione Philosophia stems from its source, Alfarabi de Scientis, or De Enumeratione Scientiarum, text written in Baghdad between the 9th and 10th centuries. This work was translated into Latin twice, first in an adaptation by Gundisalinus, and later by Gerard of Cremona. The Muslim Al-Farabi drew upon the Alexandrian tradition a Neoplatonism that read Aristotle through Plato. This school included figures such as Ammonius Saccas, the master of the Neoplatonic Plotinus, and was influenced by Proclus, whose work even informed the so-called Christian Proclus, that is, the pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, a figure well known to Dante and his scholars. In the Translatio Studiorum from Alexandria to Baghdad and the subsequent flourishing of translation activity, Al-Farabi configured a hierarchy of learning that granted primacy to politics. Although Gundisalinus was indebted to Al-Farabi in his De Divisione Philosophiae, he did not grant politics the same supremacy. For him, the most vital science was instead grammar, which he saw as foundational for linguistically formulating the contents of all other disciplines. However, Gundisalinus introduced a crucial innovation. Following Al-Farabi, he redefined the arts of the trivium, the so-called scienze eloquentiae, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, as scienze civiles. That is, the learning essential for civic life. In this framework, they became political tools. Notably, he removed the dialectic from this civic category and replaced it with poetics and rhetoric. Traditionally, Latin grammar was studied, linking it to literature and auctores. Gundisalinus transformed this into a political science. Furthermore, following Al-Farabi, he classified rhetoric and poetics as branches of logic. Consequently, the Aristotelian organum was no longer composed of the traditional 6 Aristotelian works, but 8. This revolution meant that grammar, poetry, and rhetoric became political disciplines. Crucially, poetics and rhetoric served also as tools of logical knowledge, because imagination, part of poetics, and persuasion, part of rhetoric, were recognized as cognitive logical modes that, in the hierarchy inherited from Al-Farabi, were instrumental for political use. Another fundamental aspect is that in Gundisalinus, logic, that is the 8 Aristotelian science according to the reshaping of logic, was assumed to be a middle science, mediating between scienze eloquentiae, now civil sciences, and the theoretical sciences, physics, mathematics, first philosophy of metaphysics, and the practical sciences, politics, economics, ethics. Since the syllogism, as well known, is the primary logical instrument for Aristotle, it began to be applied to poetry, giving rise to what we call imaginative syllogism. And it was also, as well, it was applied to economics and politics. Thus, by highlighting Gundisalinus and his Divisione Philosophiae, Stocchi establishes a foundation for deeply understanding politics as an architectonic science, a concept coined by Aristotle and revisited by Al-Farabi, and a tradition that includes Brunetto Latini. The curriculum outlined in Latini's work, specifically his Rhetorica, a translation and commentary on Cicero de Invenzione, just the first 17 chapter of Book 1, and Latinis Tresor, was studied by scholars like Alfonso Maierù and Bruno Nardi. They proposed that both Latini and Dante may have known Alfarabi the sciences directly or indirectly. Actually, this is evident. When Dante organizes his own curriculum in the second treatise of the Convivio, where he identifies ethics as the highest of the practical sciences, reflecting in that the deep Aristotelian entanglement of ethics and politics. That is, under ethics is included the politics. In the early chapters of Brunetto Latini's Tresor, for instance, a division of philosophy is introduced that preserves elements of Arabic influence, Alfarabi no doubt, mediated by Gundisalino. But Brunetto, unlike the Archbishop of Segovia, that is Gundisalinus, makes politics the highest science. Politics teaches all the arts and traits necessary for human life, he writes, concerning both sides, deeds, and words. As we know, for Dante in the Convivio, ethics is the most important discipline among the practical sciences, as I said before. By making this choice, he certainly takes up Gundisalinus again, because Gundisalinus puts also ethics as at the highest. However, since Gundisalinus placed the politics before both economics and ethics, the primacy of politics is lost in his work. Dante, on the other hand, by placing ethics at the apex and never mentioning politics, includes in ethics the three practical sciences, that is, economy, politics, and within ethics, Convivio II. And because ethics and politics are deeply intertwined, we may say that looks for an ethics of politics. This is the focus of Dante. Donatella Stocchi-Perucchio briefly touches upon the Convivio, but her attention turns to the monarchia. Yet the idea that politics is an architectonic science is the heart of her discourse, there where it presides over the other sciences. In this sense, the various disciplines become part of politics, can be its instruments, or are related to politics, which becomes their ultimate goal. All of this governs our authors, that is Stocchi discourse, and strengthens the value given to praxis, which represents the culmination of speculation itself. As Dante writes both in the epistle to Can Grande della Scala and in the Monarchia, and as the speculation of the angels' intelligences, pure intellectual beings capable of producing the movement of the heavens, exemplifies de facto. What happens up and lies ahead is the genesis of a relational universe. If logic is a middle science that links, as we have said, the science of eloquence and civic sciences to the scienze sapientiae, that is, philosophia theoretical and practical, then the scienze eloquentiae come to include a logical cognitive tension and finality, syllogism, and above all, antimimes, truncated syllogism, penetrate grammar, that is literal language, as well as poetics and rhetoric. These now are civil science, as we have seen, usable for political ends. Proof of this will be the early Italian poetry, E Michael Scott, with his speculum doctrinale, will be the theoretical herald of this at the court of Frederick II. In conclusion, regarding the development of 13th century theory of learning and what is called the eclectic Aristotelianism, I will recall a few lines written by Ferdinand Fastenbergen. Here, St. Fastenbergen. Ignorance of medieval philosophical thought and of its components, which include not just Latin, but also Arabic, Hebrew, philosophical and scientific learning, is no longer acceptable, especially concerning the text of Dante, his circle of intellectual poets, and his ancestors and descendants. Dante Politico, therefore, requires and postulates an adequate reader, equipped with the knowledge of the due organization of learning. And no doubt, this is what Dante attempted to pursue in Monarchia and mostly in the very difficult Convivio. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank my colleague at New York University, Eugenio Refini, Alison Cornish, Luisa Ardizzone, for hosting this presentation. It makes me feel so honored. And to all of you who came to listen to us, but also for the insight they came from their readings. In many ways, authors or editors end up being surprised by what readers see. And so certainly I found your readings tremendously enriching and illuminating. I also want to thank my colleague from Cornell, Tim Campbell, for coming all the way here to participate. And also my dear friend, Dr. Arnold Lisio, who is a great supporter of Italian studies at the University of Rochester, and the one who instituted the name chair that I have the honor to occupy. I have to say that this book is a tribute to his generosity. So I'm glad he's here tonight. Now, you've said many things that I don't need to repeat, so I will concentrate, if you allow me, to make a few points, more to provoke a conversation in your questions than anything else, about the second part of the second objective in this book that has to do with my own specific contribution, which is the fact that I seek to highlight Dante's potential to promote a discussion on the transformative synergy between politics and education. And I think this discussion is rendered particularly urgent at the present historical moment. So I would like to say something about this notion. By this phrase, I refer to Dante's project as it is articulated in the Epistle to Can Grande and in the Monarchy. In both texts, Dante presents both the poetic and the theoretical work as concerned not with speculation, that is theoretical knowledge, but with praxis, that is political knowledge. Their shared goal being, and I quote Dante, to remove those living in this life from a state of misery and to bring them to a state of happiness. A transformative project oriented towards praxis, which in Dante is nevertheless always interdependent with and contiguous to speculation, is already evident in both the Convivio and the Monarchy. His project is grounded on a set of principles values and cultural parameters that I will selectively outline here in order to argue the following: that the overturning of these values is the hallmark of our time, and that Dante may serve as an antidote, as an alternative model against the pernicious and paralyzing effects of this overturning. So these are my central points in bringing together the then and the now. And these points, one has been already elucidated by Maria Luisa Ardizzone: politics as an architectonic science, as the architectonic science. So Dante belongs, as we heard, to the tradition according to which politics is architectonic, in the sense that this science guides all sciences, both speculative and practical, toward the end of the human community, the goal of the human community, which is happiness. An idea that extends from Aristotle, and I would dare saying, to Einstein. Even Einstein talks about the fact that science by itself doesn't have any resources to guide the human community. It needs political guidance. It's an intuition that Thomas Aquinas had very clearly when he reiterated this point in his commentary to the Ethics, saying politics guides towards the use even of theoretical sciences, whose specific objectives is the truth, but the practical sciences together with theoretical have to be all guided by politics. So politics is part of the practical, but is also a kind of outside leader of the whole project of knowledge. So this is the first value and principle. The other one is Dante's philosophical universalism. So happiness is the realization of the human potential, which for Aristotle is achieved in the polis, and for Dante in the universal community theorized in the monarchy. A form of philosophical universalism, which I describe as a kind of communitarianism, consisting of a universal vision of society in which there is unity without homogenization and plurality without fragmentation. Now, this idea is to be kept in mind when we will compare the turning of these values in our time and age. The third value is liberum arbitrum and human agency. Liberum arbitrum is the indispensable instrument for the realization of the human goal. Dante says in the Monarchy, per ipsum felicitamur ut homines, we become happy as human beings through this faculty. Per ipsum, through this faculty, we become happy as gods. So he's clearly alluding to the true happiness that will be the conclusion of the treatise. In the comedy, this becomes the interdependence of moral freedom and political liberty embodied in the figure of Cato. Another value is open temporality and futurity, a conception of time oriented toward the future in which even the past can be reinterpreted in light of what is to come, and also the possibility of regeneration and new beginnings is always open. This is Purgatorio. Another one, prophetic and utopian posture. A prophetic and utopian commitment, and I put these two together, to transformation. This is made of the denunciation on the one hand, on Dante's part, and hope on the other. Denunciation of the satanic, violent, cannibalistic condition of the city in Inferno, the city of Ciacco, Farinata, and Ugolino, and juxtaposed with it, the vision of hope represented by the city of Sordello and Virgil. And then relational anthropology. Dante advances a relational, logocentric, and communitarian conception of humanity, a theological and philosophical anthropology, I call it, in which the logos is the principle of likeness to God, both in interiore homine, within the human being, and inter homines, among human beings. Now, Canto 10 of the Inferno stages this conception in contrast with the disjunctive anthropology advanced by Cavalcanti in Donna Me Prega. We know that Donna Me Prega is a subtext in Inferno 10. A view in which the faculties of the soul are split. Love and knowledge are mutually exclusive, and the subject is passively submitted to material laws. Such an anthropology yields an atomized and violent political order that Dante refuses to consider definitive and immutable. Unlike Cavalcanti, for whom both love and politics are subject to necessity, for Dante they constitute the very ground of human choice. To rescue these fundamental dimensions of human existence from the tyranny of necessity and to restore them to the sphere of agency is a central priority of his intellectual agenda. So Dante thus empowers the subject with agency, an insight articulated by Marco Lombardo in the Method of Purgatorio, thereby opening the possibility of transformative political action. Now, seen in their complementarity, the comedy and the monarchy aim to refocus the polis on the basis of this relational anthropology. And this is why Dante presents his political project of the empire as a restoration of wholeness and integrity. This is the salute from Sanus, whole, of Umile Italia, low-lying Italy in Inferno 1, in the comedy, and of humankind, pro salute humani generis, for the benefit of humankind, in the monarchy, second book. Integrated into a theological horizon, as suggested by the semantic field of salute, both wholeness and salvation, this project is political before it is eschatological, inscribed within a salvific design that exceeds history but begins within history. So I recapitulated these points, these values, because my claim in talking about the now is that the overturning of these values is the hallmark of our time, as I said before. What do I mean by that? Well, the first point concerns the architectonic science. I think that economic is the new architectonic science. And this is something that I frame within the neoliberal system, within globalization as the new universal project of the neoliberal system, and its attending ideology, which is what I call the pensée unique, using a term that the French journalist and intellectual Ramonet coined in the late 90s to refer precisely about this neoliberal agenda, which promotes a view of the world that is sort of unified, and immutable. I'm going to expand a little bit on that. The other points, this attending ideology has a claim to universality, and so that's the ideological universalism that I juxtapose to the philosophical universalism of Dante. The new finality of knowledge, which is utilitarian and no longer communal happiness, but a utilitarianism that is often tied to privilege and accumulation of wealth. Human agency today clashes with theories of the inevitable, inducing surrender to the status quo as inevitable. Presentism that makes us feel determined by the past and deprived of the future. And then we have the new anthropological type of the consumer. And finally, something that often touches very closely our students, the new notion of practical education, which means studying everything that allows them in their mind to fit in the system as their goal. So these are the points that I see we should debate and discuss to see in what way Dante could be used as an antidote, as a voice of an alternative, of alternatives, that it would be useful to evoke as food for thought, for especially for the new generations in this particular context that usually induces acquiescence and lack of political participation. I don't know if you want me to go ahead further or if we want to open it to the discussion. I could say a few more things briefly. Tell me. How are you doing with time?
We also have last presentation. Perhaps you can. A few more minutes would be fine.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Then we do the other.
5 minutes, yeah, because I don't want to confine it to what we say. I would like to involve the audience and see how they react to this provocation in a way. So let me say a little bit more about this idea of the substitution of the architectonic science. So in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and more intensely at the end of the short 20th century, marked by the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990-91, a momentous role reversal has gradually and yet inexorably taken place in the West. Economics has replaced politics in the direction of world affairs, de facto becoming the new architectonic science. No longer the Aristotelian science of the household, the oikos from which it derives its name, economics is synonymous today with the dominant neoliberal system. Such a system looks at the world as its horizon and at globalization as the progressive worldwide expansion of the system itself. While globalization's theorists and supporters present it as an agent for universal prosperity, this westernized economic model, rather evocative of the Aristotelian climatistics, as Alison said, without peras, which is limit, exacerbated existing problems and generated new ones. For many of its critics, in fact, neoliberal globalization has brought about a continuation of colonialism under a new guise and has disseminated across the globe the Western model of development responsible for the looming environmental catastrophe. In the process of establishing its hegemony, and in contrast with the widespread opinion that we live in a post-ideological era, neoliberalism has de facto devised an attending ideology that Ramonet labeled with a felicitous and no less ominous expression, la pensée unique, or single thought, calling it a modern dogma, and he gave it this definition. What is la pensée unique? In Italian, pensiero unico. It is the translation of the interests of a body of economic forces, those in particular of international capital, into ideological terms pretending to universality. So this universality, which I insist is the ideological version, stresses the interest, meaning specific private oligarchic individualistic interests versus the ethos of Dante, which is inter esse, be in between and among, this relational anthropology that I stressed. And part of this dogma is something that could be easily summarized with the acronym coined by Margaret Thatcher, the TINA, there is no alternative. So this is the best we could achieve with our progress, and that's it. This goes with the end of history. What else can we expect? This is the conclusion of a process, and we all have to cherish this conclusion. So the consequence of this, that has sort of acquired the status of a culture, is a considerable decrease in political participation. The voting absenteeism in the US and in Italy is a telling example. Distrust in democratic representation and democratic alternation, blurring of traditional distinctions between left and right, rise to power of authoritarian and extremist far-right movements, success of populist and demagogic tactics, and the prevalence, albeit in disguise, of power politics on the international scene. So, this phenomenon has affected academia as well, and this I leave it to you as another provocation. I would just like to conclude by saying that Dante should be located in this intellectual political turn that is marked on one side by Edward Said, who was one of the interpreters of these crisis that he called an assault to thought, almost as if he were talking about la pensée unique, or everybody atomized thinks the same, instead of thinking together. This is how Maria Luisa Ardizzone tells us that Dante mean by the unified intellect, an invitation to think together, which is different from thinking the same. So Edward Said was one of the people who identified this crisis and promoted a new direction for literary and cultural studies that were also directed towards transformation. And on the philosophical side, Hannah Arendt, for me, is somebody who initiated a turn towards a return to practical philosophy as the philosophy that deals with the world of praxis. For Hannah Arendt, the plural political world is our space of vita activa, is our space for political action, and the very nature of our human the very major aspect of our human nature. Her book Vita Activa was in fact translated as The Human Condition into English. So Dante fits in this context for me, and with this I don't want to keep you any longer. I would like to pass the podium to Tim Campbell and then have some reactions to these thoughts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here to speak with you today in the context of Dante Politico, a recent volume that my friend and colleague Donatella Stocchi-Perucchio has published, Perspectives on Dante Politico. I should immediately tell you that I'm a casual and itinerant reader of Dante, which in an audience of some of the country's most renowned Dante scholars feels like a necessary confession of what is surely an original sin, one to which I duly confess. I will try to make this sin into a form of method. My own research has, over the years, focused on what has been properly or improperly called Italian theory or Italian thought, an attempt to find commonalities across Italian philosophical culture, apart from the usual debts that one places on either Foucault or Heidegger. Some of these commonalities include a will to community, a will to militancy, a kind of comic sensibility, perhaps, which are seen as characterizing Italian culture from the birth of the Italian language to today. More recently, my work has shifted to asking how the pandemic altered global health and thinking about health inequalities across the global north and south. And here, of course, images of Bergamo, we recall, are integral, it seems to me, to the global meaning of the pandemic. More recently, my interest has turned to what has been called the planetary city and the challenges it faces. With Dante's emphasis on the divided city and inequality, he provides us with coordinates to make sense of that city at this moment. My question for us and for me is, how does Dante help us find the coordinates for thinking not just a different future, but a different present? So today I would like to treat our encounter as an occasion to bring together some of these concerns I've mentioned above with the terms and the lexicon that Donatella, Professor Stocchi-Perucchio, adopts in her book. The assumption of that book is an assumption that I share. If there is a Dante Politico, and I think that there is, then there is a Dante who is our contemporary. The second reason is simpler. In the current moment of political strife and conflict nearly everywhere, Dante Politico offers us a perspective on the importance of thinking together, to pick up what you just said, including remarks. What Donatella refers to in the introduction as the form of resistance to a system that relies on, and I'm quoting her, uniformity of thought and a collective thinking effort in the form of new creative approaches to knowledge, end quote. Perhaps our conversation today can be repurposed as a form of resistance, one that approaches what Maria Luisa Ardizzone, in a not-so-different context, calls our humanitas, the natural vocation of human beings to think together and to live together, end quote. To think Dante in a way that makes him our contemporary is one that many leading figures of Italian thought today have, it seems to me, not fully pursued. Roberto Esposito, in Living Thought, The Origins and Actuality of Italian Philosophy, reads Monarchia in opposition to the Convivio, which he sees as a liberation into the vernacular, and hence a deeply important text for Italian national, political, and philosophical culture. What matters most for Esposito is how Dante transmits the avoristic, impersonal intellect to vernacular culture, and how Dante's possible intellect is to be read as a kind of collective, but more than that, I would say, impersonal power. There are two passages of interest, it seems to me, that Esposito focuses on, and he's not alone in this. He's a stand-in for others as well. And they're not surprisingly ones that have been mentioned. Book 1, Chapter 3 of the Monarchia. Let me read them to you, and then I'll say give a brief gloss. So the first is, the spectacular intellect becomes by extension the practical, whose end is to do and to make. I speak of things to be done, which are controlled by political sagacity, and things to be made, which are controlled by art, because they are all handmaids of speculation, that supreme end for which the primal good brought into being the human race. The second, and since this capacity as a whole cannot be reduced to action at one time through one man or through any of the society discriminated above, multiplicity is necessary in the human race to actualize its capacity in its entirety. Esposito, and again, he's not alone, is drawn to Dante's emphasis on multiplicity in the human race, which is why the possible intellect gets so much attention in Esposito's later works. Much less interest falls, again, speaking of Esposito, on the monarch, who largely disappears in these readings. Without naming all of the reasons why this might be the case, and there are many, we might simply say that Esposito wants to push back against any kind of theological readings of philosophy more broadly. And that's been something that's been true, I would say, over the course of his writings, even dating back to the early 90s. For Toni Negri, what matters is actualizing the totum potentium intellectus possibilis, that is, the whole capacity of the possible intellect. And here again, Chapter 3 appears, as does Chapter 4. For Negri, key is the drive to actualize the possible intellect as a part of a larger project. None of this is surprising, to a revolutionary, collective, and ontological form that he and Hart will call the multitude. It precedes the collective revolutionary subject, of course. It's a precursor to the collective revolutionary subject. Not surprisingly, Dante will fade in relevance after that. And that's not surprising, either in Esposito or in Negri's account. And the reason is because Dante does not appear as our contemporary. He's inscribed in other philosophical traditions that have lost relevance. Giorgio Agamben, his perspective on Dante needs to be thought separately, it seems to me, from Esposito and Negri. He is undoubtedly the one who most wants to read Dante as our contemporary. But I think we need to be clear about how he does that and how he does not do that. To see how, let me share with you Agamben's definition of the contemporary. So I haven't mentioned that the contemporary is something that's coming from Agamben, and that's just to highlight the fact that I want to use Agamben's definition of the contemporary against him. Here's a quote. Contemporaneousness is then a singular relationship with one's own time, which adheres to it and at the same time keeps a distance from it. It is that relationship with time that adheres to it through a disjunction and an anachronism. Those who coincide too well with the epoch, those who are perfectly tied to it in every respect, are not contemporaries, precisely because they do not manage to see it. If we follow this line of thought, we would want to see where Dante's thought breaks from the period in which he is writing, the ways he is not entirely tied to it. For it is there, I think, that our paths cross. And it is Agamben who writes, it's a question of seeing and of deciding not to lower one's gaze. Clearly, much of Agamben's reading of the crisis of institutions and modernity more broadly is deeply indebted to Dante's perspective. In Agamben's most recent works, the emphasis falls on what he calls the katekon, the restraining power, and on the distinction between legitimacy and the often no longer legal. In modernity, he argues, institutions are no longer legitimate and no longer legal. So there's a crisis of legitimacy that societies attempt to solve through legal means, through the law, but that are doomed to fail. Although he does not quote the monarchia directly, the distinction he continually draws upon between spiritual and temporal power, those of you that have read Agamben know this, is one that runs throughout the monarchia. Thus, we might say that for Agamben, Dante is our contemporary to the degree that we share with him the same eschatological conditions, the end of time, the saving grace, etc. And yet, if we were to push Agamben's reading of the contemporary to include Dante, then Dante might not actually be contemporary to us, for we belong to the same coming and same arriving messianic time, that we haven't created enough, this is my point, we haven't created enough disjunction, or that Agamben hasn't created enough disjunction from him, and that not enough disjunction has continually reproduced in these readings of Dante. Which brings me to Dante Politico. The Dante that emerges in the book and in the reading, and in the contributions to that volume more generally, is a Dante who is contemporary to the degree he's concerned with the common good, and with what is insisted upon in the book, that the necessary condition for the common good is universal peace. There is much that we want to focus on precisely on this question, the comparison that we've heard has been drawn between Cavalcanti's Donna mi prega and Dante, between the deterministic reading of love and Dante's development of what Donatella has called a relational anthropology, which is a terrific term. What stands out in the Cavalcanti-Dante dispute is how central conflict is for how Cavalcanti love proceeds from the darkness of Mars, where it is a tragic experience, one that, quote, makes intellect and love radically heterogeneous entities, end quote, and that's in Giuseppe Mazzotto's phrase. Building on this, Donatella divides between a Dantesque vision of relational harmony and in which love and intellect are not radically separate. Implicit in this reading, in her reading, is that conflict is not inherent, or it's not the only thing inherent in human nature, and that civil war is not the only political outcome that's possible. Her readings are a helpful tonic for when one is picking up Esposito, Agamben, and to a lesser extent Negri. Conflict, strife, civil war are continually featured in Italian thought. They're just all over the place. It's certainly bubbling there in Hart and Negri as well in their notion of multitude. And it's especially pronounced in Agamben's work on the state of exception and stasis. Indeed, one could draw a line through Italian philosophical culture beginning with Cavalcanti, it seems to me, leading to today. On the other side is Dante Politico, and the Dante Politico that emerges from this volume is a Dante that we need to be in conversation with. If we follow Agamben and say that to be contemporary is to maintain a disjunction from one's own time and not to shy away from brandishing anachronism as a method and a practice, then in this particular moment in which vita mia morta tua seems to characterize relations between neighbors and between states alike, to be the contemporary of Dante is precisely to adopt the disjunction in order to see. And here Dante becomes extraordinarily important. In a moment when Florence was divided, when Dante was in exile, or likely in exile, when inequality was the order of the day, Dante provided the following diagnosis in Monarchia. Quote, "It must be noted that the worst enemy of justice is cupidity. When cupidity is removed altogether, nothing remains inimical to justice. Cupidity is impossible when there is nothing to be desired, for passions cease to exist with the destruction of their objects." Another quote, "To the extent, however small, that cupidity clouds the mental attitude toward justice, clarity or right love clarifies and brightens it. Avarice, scorning man's competency, seeks things beyond him, but charity, scorning all else, seeks God and man, and therefore the good of man. And since to live in peace is chief of man's blessings, charity will make justice thrive greatly." Today, when conflict seems everywhere and is even celebrated, and where, as I've suggested, Italian philosophical thought risks continually reaffirming this, Professor Stocchi-Perucchio's reading of Dante offers us something else. A utopian, prophetic Dante? Yes. A Dante who can redescribe what it means to think politically? Yes. And this Dante Politico asks us, where and how does one think the common good today? As I say, it's an extraordinarily important question because it goes to one of the most important aspects of the Commedia, Dante's commitment to political education, and in particular to the belief that what is politically desirable is not permanently beyond human reach, even if seemingly unattainable. If one is constantly highlighting conflict as productive, and I understand that impulse, especially in Italian philosophical culture whose debt to Machiavelli is tremendous. What also needs to be recalled, and this is what the reading of Dante Politico reminds us of, is that there is another alternative, one in which we do not only map how Dante's eschatological context matches our own, but how our contemporaneity lies in shared greed, cupidity, and a failure of political imagination to think the common good again. I have two final observations. The first is practical. If we want students to continue to read Dante today, we need actually to see Dante as our contemporary. I am aware of the dangers of making superficial affinities between today and his time, but the risk is worth it. It would mean finding the places where our time and his are alike enough to create discomfort. Frustration, discomfort. Here they can be found in the divided city and the common good that we struggle to imagine. The second is a question of how we relate to our own time. I wonder if there isn't an opportunity to use the present as a moment for thinking, and not just relating to it as the present, as if all were lost, as if democracy has come to an end, as if the common good will never come into view. We relate to the present as if it were the only present that is possible, and the voices that tell us that the sooner we accept that the common good isn't coming back, that the easier time we will have of it, that this is the only possible present. These voices are powerful, they're incessant, they're loud, and they're just incredibly boring. And yet, to see otherwise, to see that others before us found ways to separate themselves from their time. This requires work. It requires education, since to be contemporaneous with the future and with the past means learning how to separate ourselves from this time. It means adopting a perspective that is unfamiliar. In this sense, to return to the beginning of my presentation, perhaps what is required is learning how to sin, but not to sin against today, but not by committing sins of commission or omission, but by something we might call the sins of the imagination. Thank you.
minutes left, and if there are questions for our presenters, we do have a microphone going around, and so I would invite, yes, Stefano.
To work, yeah. Hi, everyone. Sorry. I have a general question. It's not addressed to everyone and to the specific. Just if you think if you have any comments, if you think it's interesting, if you can say something to that. So first, Professor Cornish evoked Negri in Heart Empire. And first of all, he mentioned the idea of the moderno nasce con Dante, which is a very general statement. But I think the very interesting one is the idea of Dante, or his time, described as human beings as creators of their own world, and also the idea of the reappropriation of certain powers. And also I think Professor Cornish at one point, still quoting them, you mentioned the idea of society made by man. So usually these are topics more associated with the early modern period, I would say. The Middle Ages, it's always a little bit risky to put these terms up front. So I just wanted to ask in general to all of you, to what extent do you agree with this idea brought forward in Empire? So associating Dante with modernity in the sense of human beings that can create their own world and society, and to what extent you're not agreeing with this idea?
First, Alison.
This one. Yeah, I guess I don't agree. I mean, I don't really agree with Hart and Negri. Yeah, it's kind of a dated book, actually. I think it's from 2000, 2001. Yeah. I mean, I see their point. They're my point at the end of saying, what about the two goals? I mean, I think there is a tendency in our modernity to say, Dante's one of us. He is going towards the modern, where we do it ourselves. We are our own salvation. We can solve all the problems. It's sort of the solutionism that Andrea was talking about yesterday, right? That he's one of us in that sense. And so it completely ignores the other part of it, which is that there's two beatitudes, there's two roads, there's two sons, there's two. And of course, at the time, it was important to him the problem was the corruption of the church, and so you needed this other jurisdiction, let's call it, this other authority of the secular realm and everything. But you needed both, and I think that's what kind of gets lost in some modern appropriations of Dante, is forgetting that there's a whole transcendent element, that he's not just the immanent, he's also the transcendent. So yeah, I would say I disagree, but I don't know.
So is the question is, do we, I guess there are two, yes, I agree with Negri's statement. I feel somehow not qualified to be able to say, where that response seems fairly clear to me, that there is, and I think that it makes sense that the transcendent part would be elided in the Negri piece. But I'm pragmatic at this point. So if the Dante doesn't work, it's still okay in terms of the creative. But your question was really about how Dante is being appropriated by certain thinkers today, and I think there are clearly issues. I was pointing to them too. There are clearly issues in the way that Dante is being appropriated. My other thought, though, is that Dante continues to be fair game, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. And then we just have a conversation about what doesn't work and what doesn't. As I say, I'm utterly pragmatic about that.
I also disagree on this idea of making Dante a secular thinker. I don't think that would just cut him in half and would dismember these relational anthropology that I talked about, which has a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension, that they intersect together, that they hinge on the same point. I would like to say at the same time something by quoting a colleague of mine who is a theologian, with whom I was talking about Ernest Bloch and Benjamin, and the fact that they are thinkers who think in terms of prophecy and utopia and hope. And Massimo Cacciari's comment on that, saying, well, but they're all atheists. They're all atheists, so what's the point? And my colleague, the theologian, said, that's irrelevant. So at the practical level, it's irrelevant in terms of what Dante could help us to do. That's my modest answer.
Maria Luisa, would you like to add something on this point?
Nothing at all.
Nothing at all.
I am really
Freezing. Yeah, I think everybody's freezing, so.
I mean, if there's a burning last question, of course, that's my rule, but...
So we can warm up.
Exactly. Otherwise, yes, one over here, please.
I have not a question, but a comment. In my experience, what Dante can give us all is not answers to questions, but if we follow the progress of this person from a moribund sense, from having no sense of connection of any kind, all the way through, step by step, by an almost infinite number of passages, so thinly sliced, that in engaging in that process, we see ourselves and we come to understand things that he's not telling us, but he is giving us in the experience of joining him on that progress.
Thank you.
Well, then I would like to thank... yes, sure.
What is the evidence of Dante's influence on Machiavelli?
A lot.
I have one comment.
Yeah, Machiavelli talks about reading Dante and quotes him and everything. So there's quite a bit of evidence that he read Dante. He also takes Dante to task about how this de vulgari eloquentia, this illustrious vernacular, what are you talking about? It's just Florentine. So he really takes him to task and is in dialogue with him quite a bit. Yeah, for sure.
That would be the topic for another...
Aside from that, very quickly, I would just say that... See. No, I just wanted to say that Dante anticipates Machiavelli with Guido da Montefeltro, but of course, I mean, he wants his hero, infernal hero, to be just a fox, and instead Machiavelli would want his prince hero to be both a fox and a lion, following Cicero, no? But these are virtues for Machiavelli, for Dante are sins of fraud. So that's the major divide, I think, that we should keep in mind. But of course, there is all that Alison pointed out to Maria Luisa.
Oh, it's just for Professor Campbell. You have given us a kind of summary about the interpretation of some contemporary philosophers, yes. Esposito, etc., yeah. About the possible intellect, yes. Which is one of the most difficult theories. And I would like you could give us a kind of summary in which you summarize the meaning, because it was really dispersive for me.
Yes.
I have worked on this topic.
No, I know you have. So, summarize Esposito's views on the possibility. So, I guess I might begin by saying that, I mean, here I would have to, I would need your help. I don't know, you can confirm this, but I don't know that Dante uses possible intellect that frequently in the Monarchia. Well, but certainly it. Well, so,
If they don't read, wow, we can.
but here's my point is this, is that precisely because it doesn't appear so frequently, it becomes a tempting target for these philosophers, and that they can be, the fact that Negri can read it, possible intellect, as collective power, and Esposito can read it as a kind of impersonal power, suggests that it's ambiguous enough or capacious enough.
It's not wrong. It's not wrong. So it's different.
I am not, as I say, I'm a sinner. So I trust you to tell me, whether this is.
You have summarized it in a very nice way. Now it's perfect. So could you just
Yes.
make an addition on something else?
About how,
Possible intellect.
about the possible intellect.
So.
I would be summarizing the way that others have used it. This is not my view of this. Is that what you're asking? So, boy, I really wish Roberto were here, because he's the interlocutor you need to be speaking to. But essentially, my sense of this is that, and I'm just going to improvise. But if I think it's difficult because you need to get from an impersonal relationship, so the impersonal that's coming through a variety of different figures, so you're thinking Simone Weil in particular, right? And the kind of knowledge that results from an impersonal, the third person's relation as an observer of a situation or of a historical context. Bear with me, right? That kind of knowledge, right, if you combine it, right, without transcending it, it remains immanent, would work as a kind of impersonal knowledge that Esposito is talking about for a possible intellect, right? Yeah, I think it is. I agree. I do. I think there's. Look, I mean, I've seen. This is anecdotal and experiential, but. I mean, maybe those of us that teach have had this experience. We're in a classroom, and it's a particularly really vibrant day, and students are thinking, and they're thinking together, and they're commenting on each other's thoughts. And in that moment, this might be an example of the kind of possible intellect that Esposito is thinking about. It's an impersonal one that emerges out of a collective endeavor. Okay, so you would have that would be. If I were ventriloquizing Esposito, that would be how I imagine he might respond to this. So that's I think something that I don't know, you could agree with it or not agree with it, but I think that there's. Thank you. Right. So there's that. The Negri question is one. I mean, this came up in the question earlier. I mean, I think that. How can I put this? Because Negri is useful, right? But he's less a close. He's not as attentive philologically as others are to these texts. I mean, Negri's history is not as a philologist, right? And Esposito is. So there's a disciplinary connection that's coming that it might explain the differences between them. And that feels kind of cheap to say it, but I think there's some disciplinary constraints that are coming here. And also just because, the possible intellect and the general intellect, you're like, well, I want to make that jump. I want to be able to think about them together if you're coming from that kind of formazione of Negri's. So, I don't know. Where do they, it's interesting because I don't know that they have, where does the distinction lie in how they're using Dante, right? That's the question, right? And I think they both saw possible intellect, and it's attempting, it's capacious, right? And so, they're smart guys. So why wouldn't you just, yes?
We say that, okay, at first, congratulations, because you were able to summarize some difficult topic in a very clear way. The only thing I want to say is,
yes.
If they read just monarchia,
yes.
they cannot get the true meaning of the problem, because monarchia is the final phase of Dante's problem with this possible intellect.
Sorry, I may interrupt you. Please finish. Yeah.
Okay. The center of this is convivio.
Yes.
Convivio is written precisely as an attempt
Yes.
to find the solution of this problem.
Yes.
When he writes the monarchia,
Yes.
beyond the problem, he reshapes the notion.
Yes.
Donatella has recalled me, but actually this was John de Giordano, not Ardizzone, who said that the possible intellect is the general way in which people interact. So it's a construction which includes multiple
yes.
thinking together.
Yes. Yes.
But who brought the topic? You know who is a scholar of Dante, Bruno Nardi. Nardi understood the importance of Jean de Jandun. When I repeated this notion in a symposium in Göttingen, people were horrified. Just to explain what happens. They were from Germany, do you remember correctly? And they were horrified. This is the story of Nardi who understands the problem. Okay, so now, just one thing. What you said about Esposito is extremely intelligent, in my opinion, because this impersonality focuses on is precisely what Dante reaches at the end of the convivio. So, thank you.
On this note, I'm sorry to ruin the party.